Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, IVR in the Age of AI, presented by Computer Instruments. Before we begin, thank you for participating in today's webcast and for your support of IAUG. To our current members and those that are now new members by means of joining us today, I encourage you to visit iaug.org to get more information about how to get the most out of your membership, including upcoming events, IAUG councils, committees, and a library of online content. Now, before we begin, I have 3 quick housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webinar will be recorded and available for you on demand. Second, a Q&A session will follow today's presentation, or you know what? In fact, it's better as well to just submit your questions as they come up, and we will address those live as well. All questions will need to be entered into the Q&A window in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And third, there will be a short evaluation that pops up as you exit the webinar. Please take the time to fill it out and let us know what you thought of today's session and what you may like to see going forward. And with that, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll turn it over to our presenter, Tim, for today.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tim Barnes. I am a relatively new addition to Computer Instruments as the Chief Marketing Officer. A little bit about me before we jump into the presentation. I've spent about 30 years in voice and communications, beginning my career at Sprint as a systems engineer, and both the local and long distance side of the business, and then moving on to Genesis, which some of you may be familiar with, being very early in at Genesis and staying there for 5 years as they grew, went public, and ultimately were acquired by Alcatel. And during that time, I moved into product management and product marketing. I've worked on building out contact center strategies and voice communication strategies for companies like Wayfair, Airbnb, Oracle, spending about half my career in Silicon Valley, some time in Europe, and most of it in Kansas City in the middle of the United States, where we have a massive crossroads of telecommunications fiber, and where Sprint was founded, now T-Mobile. So in my role as Chief Marketing Officer, we wanted to share a little bit about what I think is probably one of the most important questions anyone working in communications and working with voice automation, in particular interactive voice response, IVRs or IVAs, intelligent voice assistants, needs to be thinking about. And that is, how does my IVR change, translate, adapt? What are the drivers, the things I need to consider now that AI has become more and more mainstream? So with that, I'll go ahead and get right to it. Just a quick blurb on CI, Computer Instruments, 46-year-old company based in Kansas, that offers a SaaS platform for voice automation and customer engagement technologies. And our mission, and a quote from our founder, Chris Herring. Being a 46-year-old company, we've seen a lot of things change over the years. As you can see here from Chris's quote, we began our journey really with voicemail and a lot of unified communications type solutions, and are now offering everything from call control and callback messaging solutions when people are on hold, all the way to fully AI-enabled receptionists and voice assistants for organizations. We've worked with hundreds of organizations over the last 46 years, and seen them change and adapt and move through different technologies, but we are primarily focused on the Avaya ecosystem, Avaya IP Office, Avaya Cloud Office, and all of the Avaya PBXs. So I'm going to go ahead and just build out this slide real quick. And again, as Maddie mentioned, please feel free to type in questions as we go along. I love for this to be more interactive. But I want to just touch a little bit on the previous webinar where we talked about some of the problems that exist with IVR in its current state. Many times, and this may not necessarily describe your IVR, but we have text-to-speech type voices that aren't highly tuned, so they sound a bit robotic. It's very clear that that is being machine generated. And we have a limited set of options. There's really good reasons for this, and we rely on touch tone. So as many of you already know, the reason that we have a limited set of options is not just the 12 numbers and symbols on the phone keypad. It also has to do with the fact that we want to ensure that we're not placing too much of a cognitive load on the caller. So most people can remember 3 to 5 options pretty well. Once we start expanding beyond that, we start to frustrate callers because they're having to remember 8 different options or listen for the one they need, or perhaps the reason they're calling doesn't fit exactly, or they're unfamiliar with the application, meaning they're not calling all the time. So that limits a lot of design options when building out that IVR. So whether you're touch tone or even speaking, cognitive load becomes an issue. How many options am I going to present to the caller? Um, the other big challenge is that many people, because of caller frustration, will start to look for the one option that leads them to an agent as fast as possible. Um, that can tend to then increase hold times. And now we've got callers waiting on hold. We're paying for the nailed up cost of that queue, and we're building on the frustration of that particular caller. I don't think it's hard for any of us to think of an experience that we've had that has been frustrating, or one where we're immediately pressing 0 or pound, and trying to find a way to get to a live agent, right? So from Avaya themselves, 60% of customers find IVR systems frustrating. They participate. Participation rates vary. The better designed ones get higher rates of participation. And as we get new tools, such as the advent of speech recognition, which we started to see more and more of in the early 2000s, we're able to solve some of that frustration, potentially get better metrics for the things we're measuring on. And we'll talk a little bit more about those metrics in a moment, and get higher participation rates, start to recoup more of our investment. But the reality is that IVR has been around so long, and it provides so much value to an organization in terms of cost control, which has been the primary driver of self-service and IVR systems, that it's very difficult to remove these. Also, there's tends to be more and more cost and budget pressure put on contact centers and agents answering questions. And so in order to alleviate that pressure, to have the appropriately sized contact center, we've seen more and more attempts to make IVR more usable. And those come with corresponding costs as well. So if you got 60% of your customers frustrated, if you're dealing with a limited number of options and menus, if people are pounding 0 and moving immediately to a queue to wait for agents to answer questions, even if that front end IVR is saving you money, if you're starting to experience those kinds of things where you're seeing participation rates low, where you're starting to see your queues build up over time, where perhaps maybe the metrics that you've measured, the ROI or the potential cost saving on, have started to go flat, it might be time to think about an IVR upgrade. So one thing you might want to consider or think about as we move forward into the next slides is what sort of things are happening in your particular caller environment, and do any of those sound familiar? Or are you even perhaps seeing other indicators? So there's many that I'm not touching on. I'm just hitting the very big ones. But if you're starting to see those kinds of indicators, then it might be time to consider an upgrade. And today's upgrade landscape is very different than it was just 5 years ago. So I don't think it's any secret that the future of IVR is going to be one where artificial intelligence plays a very large role. We can end up with smarter, better powered, AI powered technology. We can harness that technology to provide a smoother, more conversational interface, to reduce even further the cognitive load on callers, and in fact, let them drive it instead of the organization driving it. And we can begin to have customer-centered conversations. So it's really important what I just said. If you think about it today, if I call up a bank and it starts to give me a list of options. It's telling me these are the things we can do for you. But I didn't call the bank to have them tell me what they can do for me. I have something I want done, right? Whether it's transfer funds, check a balance, look into a credit card, add an authorized user, whatever that may be, the caller has intent. But today, we don't really let, unless we're fully speech enabled, the caller fully express that intent and try to match it with the self-service workflows that may exist within the organization. They have to be predefined. They have to be hooked up, and they have to have a high degree of speech recognition to even be conversational. That speech recognition, as many of you know, is not cheap. It can be quite expensive, and the implementation timelines can be very, very long. So how else could we get to this customer-centered conversation, maybe at a lower cost operationally, as well as a lower cost for the upfront implementation? And AI really allows us to do that. The cost of recognizing human speech has gone down dramatically. And the ability to let the caller tell us what their intent is in their own natural language, as opposed to saying, please say, or please choose from the following options. In fact, there's a lot of really interesting data that can be gathered when we let customers just talk to us and we start to listen. I'm sure we've all read books on customer service, seen CSAT, white papers, et cetera, that talk about listening to our customers. The funny thing is most of our IVRs are designed to talk to our customers and not to actually listen to them. So according to McKinsey, as of 2026, 72% of companies have adopted some form of AI. And we know that, and this is pretty consistent, I'm sort of picking a middle of the road statistic here, but there will be roughly 8 billion AI-powered voice assistants by the end of 2026. So this is a trend that's not going away. It's not a one-time thing. And we're going to get into the reasons why there will be 8 billion, and why it's so interesting in the options that it affords us and the things that you can do or consider, and also how to start to step into this massive paradigm shift in a way that makes sense, is reasonable, and doesn't require a massive budget. And something to think about here at the end. If any of you are already using AI within your organization, I would be really interested to hear how you're using it or where you're using it or what some of the concerns and questions are that come up. But we're going to keep the rest of this presentation solely focused on IVR. But I would imagine, and most successful AI implementations tend to move with very specific use cases where they're using artificial intelligence as opposed to just a broad coverage in one area. And so as we get into this, what we're not recommending or not putting forward as something you should consider for a strategy is just dropping everything you have in your phone system and immediately making everything AI. Rather, this is more stepping in and how you go about doing that. So one of the first things you have to consider is how you get ready to start to utilize artificial intelligence. This is going to dramatically affect your implementation timelines, whether you're using computer instruments or Accenture or any number of partners and companies that offer expertise in this area. These are fairly standard across the board. First and foremost, you've got two key questions when it comes to your data. Do you have the right data? Is it complete? Is it accurate? Can you get to it? Do you have APIs or ways to share that data? And how will you ensure compliance? Because even though you have that data, now we have to start to worry about compliance issues. The second one, which I don't think gets talked about enough, is what are your overall goals? Chances are they've probably changed since you had an initial IVR system for those of you that already have an IVR in place. Initially, you may have just been looking to help the caller by steering that call. Press 1 for sales, 2 for service, so they can get the call to the right place. Or you may have been trying to automate really simple informational requests that could be handled more quickly in an IVR than they could be handled with a live agent. And so how did you measure that? in the early days of speech recognition and sort of the IVR explosion that occurred in the late 80s and 90s, one of the first metrics we were focused on was decreasing our telco costs, right? So if we could shorten the total amount of time that we had a caller on the line, that drove the cost savings for us, whether it was from an 800 number, the software to queue up those calls, the transfer connect services from network providers. And it seems a little strange now, right? Like I have this customer, someone who's paying me money or who wants to do business with me or has a concern, and I'm trying to find a way to make that conversation as short as possible. As carrier costs, as speed and feed costs for internet connections and IP telephony, and the systems that support all of that have gone down dramatically, that becomes less of a concern. So do you have an IVR in place today that might be measured, driven, and have all of its goals oriented around simply decreasing telecom costs? Is that still the right goal? Or potentially, maybe you're looking at containment. I want to keep calls away from my call center. So if I can fully self-serve somebody in my IVR and I've got, 32 different outcomes that can occur through a series of menus, I want to contain those calls as much as possible so that my contact center isn't bothered and I can fully automate that call. And you start measuring containment and time becomes less of an issue. Is that still the right goal? Because if I'm containing that call, but the option that the caller wants is buried deep within a series of nested menus because I've automated 32 different workflows, is that really a good caller experience? If I have to go through 4 menus before I get to the one thing to get the information I want, even if I never pound on zero and get transferred to an agent, is that the outcome I want? Or maybe I'm concerned because I'm calling a healthcare provider or my health insurance company, and I'm worried that when I get connected, I'm going to be talking to an offshore call center. And maybe I, as a consumer, don't want to share HIPAA related or PCI related information with an offshore call center. I have security concerns. So I'm going to navigate all those menus, but that's just going to build and increase my customer frustration. So is containment really the right metric or goal that we should be going for? So with AI, you get presented with a lot more opportunities to even reevaluate what the goal is. We can go very high level and talk about, are we trying to save money? Are we trying to improve our customer relationship? What are the trade-offs between those two? So that's a really important thing to figure out what your overall goal is going to be and what your goal has been in the past and how you performed against that. So the last one is just organizational culture. And this is where I was asking the question about being curious if any of you have in any part of your organization already implemented AI. But is your team actually ready for this transition? Is there a basic understanding of how to manage these systems? Do people have the necessary training to support these systems? And again, going back to the strategic goal alignment, what are the new success metrics? So if the goal was cost saving before and the goal becomes our net promoter score goes up, and that's more important, then what are the metrics that drive that? So let's talk about some of those metrics, right? When it comes to data, a couple of really key things to figure out before you start approaching any vendor or looking at solutions is understanding what data that you already possess will drive these conversations. So if I don't have APIs or automations for self-service, then that's probably not going to drive that conversation. But if I know certain things about the customer, I can use that data to really drive the conversation. I also have to think about compliance, right? Whether it's PII, personally identifiable information, PCI, HIPAA, or if you happen to be in Europe or deal with European customers, GDPR. And that's going to partially drive some of your decisions around, do I want a local artificial intelligence solution and language model living in an environment that I control, or will I use a network one? If I use a network one, what are the promises I get? What sort of safeguards? And sort of ethical guardrails exist for that internet or network-based AI solution. Um, so data becomes really important. And a quick story here around data. When I worked with a very large e-commerce provider, we identified that we were having a huge cart abandonment issue. So people would have some things in their cart, they would get stuck on a decision. We could tell going backwards, not in real time, that they would call in probably to resolve a concern, and then they would abandon their cart and get frustrated and hang up on the phone. And so we did a bit of analysis and figured out if we could identify when someone who had something in their cart on our website was actually calling into our call center, and we could prioritize those calls, make them the most important call we were getting, that not only could we reduce cart abandonment rate, a lot of times we increased upsell and cross-sell with the agent on the phone. The outcome of that was millions and millions of dollars in additional revenue every month. To implement a solution like that took a big five consulting firm and about a year and a half. It cost millions of dollars. Did it ultimately pay for itself? Yes, absolutely. That sounds like a really complex, detailed sort of IVR and call routing strategy. And great big companies in the past could afford to do those things because eventually it did pay off. The really cool thing about AI is that now even smaller organizations, organizations with tighter budgets, can begin to do exactly those kinds of things. But in order to engage and and they can do those things at a much lower cost. But in order to engage and do those things, you first got to figure out where the problem lies and how you quickly test and iterate. So some of the KPIs and outcomes you should think about is where are the benefits coming from? We talked about cost reduction and telco costs or containment, and so I can lower my agent headcount. But what about instead of containment, we think about first call resolution. So if I have a fully AI-powered IVR and a person can tell me exactly why they are calling and I can understand it and present them with a workflow that'll solve their problem, even if I land with an agent, what are the economic benefits of first call resolution versus containment? That's a metric that tends to align better with using AI. Same thing with telco costs, right? In the past, we would look at trying to make those calls as short as possible, but what instead if we started to identify the economic benefit of improved customer satisfaction, improved net promoter? What does it mean every time we move up 3 points in net promoter or in customer satisfaction? Is there a quantifiable economic impact? That's a better metric to measure versus telco costs. And I'm not trying to limit you to just these metrics, but to begin to get you to think about the fact that when you're using AI, you have many more options. So you can start to think about different metrics and where they trade off, and if the old metrics still really make sense for your organization. The last one's super important, and being a small company in the middle of the United States, it's one we think about and talk about a lot, and that is feedback and tuning. When I talk about the e-commerce provider, when I was with another company, and the solution we implemented, it was just under $10 million to do the full implementation, and it took us more than a year. And with AI, we should be able to implement much faster. There are many providers and solutions out there where people are getting very excited and trying to digest all of this AI capability and do it all at once, as opposed to sort of stepping into it. They forget the continuous training, the new data that has to be organized, and they don't really have a plan for what metrics do we hit before we start to expand the use cases that we're exposing AI to, or we're using AI to expose our customers to. So sort of having a way to walk through that and to get to ROI much more quickly is really important. And anytime you're using AI, it's not a one and done. There's constant feedback and tuning, or you're going to start to get drift. You're going to start to end up with hallucinations that you're not necessarily capturing. It's a different environment. So you need to think about the fact that service costs, one, you can get operational much more fast, much more quickly, but you are going to have ongoing tuning looking at feedback, feeding in new data, and make sure that when you're talking to a vendor or looking at solutions, that those things are included. So an AI IVR, the new IVR. With this IVR, we can get much, much better performance metrics. But we have to start thinking about, again, that data. So what customer data are we going to expose to make it actually match our strategic goals? Do I need to actually expose anything that's HIPAA, PCI, or PII related, or can I use something different? So a great way to think about this is a really straightforward workflow that many places are exposed to is paying a bill. You enter the credit card number, you go through the validation checks, you make sure you've got the amount right, and you pay the bill. That's a really straightforward, simple interaction that works well for most consumers and has really high adoption rates in the existing technology without AI. It also contains a lot of sensitive information, financial information, personal information, especially when validating the card. What might be more interesting is being able to know what are the intents of this caller? What products are they subscribed to? What is their status within my organization if it's an internal facing IVR, right? Are they an employee? Are they a partner? That type of data becomes really important in making the AI aware of what the potential options are that could exist for this caller without exposing critical, very sensitive personal information. So we all know about the concept of metadata and especially what happens on social media. An AI-powered IVR can kind of begin to work in the same way. So instead of trying to have very, very detailed information on a particular caller, we can start to think about the meta categories that that caller fits and load the right sort of intents and outcomes into what the AI is thinking about when they're servicing that call without necessarily exposing things like health records. So, and when we do this, we can typically get higher rates of customer satisfaction. Callers feel known when asked questions that are relevant to them, when they are being able to drive the conversation as opposed to the conversation driving them. And when implemented properly, AI actually has less programming in terms of how you set it up and how we're surfacing the self-service options to the caller than a traditional IVR-based system where everything has to be deterministically built out. The options have to be laid out in a very strict way, or even potentially speech recognition has to be built by hand, working with recognizers, and all the different grammars have to be built out. So in the future, when we see AI moving into the IVR space, we're going to see quicker implementations and we're going to see much lower services costs. Those costs, though, are going to be lower overall, but more smoothed out across the lifetime of the system itself because of things like tuning and ongoing maintenance. But as you start to evaluate solutions, you should definitely consider that. How quickly can I take this solution, put it into production, and slowly begin to iterate and expand my use cases? So if you're interested in learning more about the future of IVR or exploring AI, we always love to have a conversation. Even if you're looking at a variety of different vendors, we'd be happy to be a part of that conversation, share our insights and our experience over the last 46 years and seeing tons of changes in the telecom space. And at this time, I'd like to open it up for questions if anybody has anything to ask. Are there any questions?
Not that I see. Just a reminder for everyone, if you do have a question, there's a Q&A feature within the webinar that you can type your question into.
All right. Well, thank you for spending part of your morning with myself and Eden and Detta and other members of the Computer Instruments team. If we can be of any assistance in the future, if you just have questions, please reach out to us. And as always, thank you for being a part of IAUG. And we look forward to seeing you sometime this year at our get-together.